Hello there, Rob. How are you?
Doing excellent, Glenn. Good to talk with you this morning.
Oh, yeah, it's very good to be talking with you. This is indeed Glenn Lowry at The Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, and I have the pleasure of talking today with Rob Montz, who is a director at the We the Internet enterprise. You can tell us what We the Internet is. Rob Montz is a documentary filmmaker, an independent filmmaker who has been paying a lot of attention to free speech issues and turmoil on college campuses, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Rob, what did I leave out that you want the world to know about your many accomplishments?
Well, and that you and I have collaborated on a project that a few people have referred to as sort of the godfather of the mini documentaries on the campus free speech controversies. You teach at Brown University, and I am a proud alum of Brown. I graduated in 2005. Yeah, We the Internet, sort of like a comedy politics YouTube show geared towards millennials. But whenever I say that it's geared towards millennials, it fills me with like a deep self-loathing. But it's just supposed to be.
Why is that?
Because I feel like I'm talking like a McKinsey consultant. Like we're trying to target millennials with our hip over the top content. What you mean is that you make videos for the internet. That's what we do. But it's kind of, it has libertarian sensibilities, but ultimately it kind of is, it's designed to break the standard left-right political divide and to try to get at some deeper truths, but then package them in ways that are compelling to everybody, but particularly young people.
Okay, so is there a website that people can go to and find the content that you and your colleagues are producing?
WeTheInternet.com.
Okay, that's easy enough. Indeed, we did collaborate, Rob, and I became a mini rock star in some quarters in virtue of
How'd that feel?
Prominence. It felt pretty good. I like the editor of that documentary film. He got my good side. You know what I
mean? You looked good. Your sentences were crisp. They was clean. Yeah, and I joked to you off camera before we started that if you wanted to refer to me as the Scorsese to your De Niro, I would not be opposed to that. As someone who's able just to get a masterwork performance out of you. I actually just showed that documentary yesterday to a group of students at a charter high school here in Washington, D.C., Basis, a very popular charter. And I had a student come up to me afterwards, after she watched the one that you and I collaborated on, and specifically said, I don't normally like documentaries, but I like his. I like yours. So I'd like to think we're able to make something that hits what we're talking about, where we're trying to take kind of sophisticated ideas that break through the standard left-right binary, but you package them in ways in which you can make them appealing to young people who have, from what I can tell, attention spans of no longer than 6 to 7 seconds. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, as someone who has to lecture to young people for a living, I'm hoping the attention span's a little bit longer than that, but it may only be due to the quality of my lectures.
So let's start with that. Let's start with that. We collaborated on a film, and I thought that there was an angle to this issue that had not been covered by the standard mainstream media coverage, and so I made a sequel tied into a controversy that had engulfed Yale University in the winter of 2015. And that came out a month or two ago. You and I have emailed about it kind of briefly, but I've actually never gotten the kind of the full luster of your thoughts on the particular angle that it takes. Let me articulate that, and then you can sort of go off from there however you feel like. The essential idea is a lot of these elite, expensive institutions have steadily gravitated away from any sort of higher educational ideals and have become increasingly more like what I've referred to as finishing schools for the ruling class. So kind of fun, expensive camps that are simply expected to shower students with enough status and prestige that they are assured kind of a smooth entryway into America's ruling elite. And then that transformation necessarily shifts the centers of powers at these schools away from the professors towards professional administrators, so bureaucrats. And bureaucrats have a different set of values and priorities than the average professor does. And that those values, those bureaucratic corporate values, were on full display in the institutional cowardice that Yale found itself displaying in the wake of the particular controversy that I ended up profiling in the second mini doc. So that's the idea.
Yeah, let me say about that. We did make this together, you and I, film. I mean, you made the film. I was a participant in it, about Brown. And it does highlight, and you made an excellent documentary film about the controversies at Yale. And they do highlight the problems that you've just described, though I don't think that's the full picture. I mean, finishing schools, concessions of power by faculty to administrators, there is some of that going on, but I think it would be a little bit trivializing of these complicated institutions to leave the narrative at that. First of all, there is pushback.
How much?
Not enough.
That's what I thought.
A lot of people are missing in action. Okay, there's not any doubt about it. A lot of people got their heads down. They're staying in their foxholes because there's ammunition flying left and right up there.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to say is I serve at Brown not only as a professor of economics and of the social sciences, but also as a member of the Faculty Executive Council. So the Faculty Executive Council is a committee that oversees the work of other faculty committees and sets the agenda for our large faculty meetings and communicates concerns of the faculty to the administration and meets regularly with the administration to undertake these duties. And in our deliberations, there is a freewheeling discussion about these matters. I mean, we are not unaware of and not unconcerned about the kinds of trends that you point to, and we often give voice to those concerns. Now, I grant you that it's not exactly...
You're saying the majority of the professors, or the majority of this committee that you sit on?
It's this committee that I sit on.
Is sympathetic to the critiques that you've been willing to level?
More sympathetic than perhaps would be your presumption, yes. More sympathetic than you might imagine. So, for example, the person who is responsible for the staff person who's responsible for seeing after student life, worrying about what happens if some controversial speaker comes to campus and kids want to shut the speech down, meeting with various student groups and whatnot. I mean, this guy runs an office. He has a staff. I grant you it's a large staff. That there are a fair number of those people, and that there is a certain amount of power. But he comes and reports to us. I'm not going to say he comes hat in hand. It's not quite like that. But he doesn't come with an imperious tone. I mean, he's not indifferent to our concerns. I mean, for example, let me be very concrete. So we have a contingency plan to deal with the emergency that a Charles Murray type event might occur where the speaker is mobbed and shouted and unable to, and you then want to repair to another venue where you can live stream the speech so that the speech will not be shut. Okay. So our guy is describing these contingency plans. And so I say, isn't this really capitulating to these rabble? In other words, we anticipate that they may shut the event down, and so we've got like an emergency backdoor plan or whatever. What about having a firm stance against that kind of behavior such that it's not necessary to rush the speaker out of the back door or whatever? And he says, well, my hope is that if we are determined to communicate to these students that the speech is going to happen no matter what, they might see the futility of behaving in such a way that the speaker cannot complete the speech, since they're not going to keep him from being heard in the first place. Yeah, I grant you. That is
Okay.
that is less than satisfying.
Well, I know. When you told me that you might potentially have some critiques for me,
You hope they will be strong.
I had to get hydrated. I wanted to make sure that I was ready for the full Glenn Lowry onslaught, and maybe it's to come. So let me just respond with this, and then I'd love your thoughts.
I'm doing the best I can, Rob. My heart's not exactly in it, as you know.
How quickly the weapon has been turned against me. So I'll tell you what happened in Middlebury, right? So
yeah, let's talk about Middlebury.
In concrete terms, and then I want to bring it back to Brown, and then I want you obviously to correct me if I have misconceptions. So,
and by the way, have you been to Middlebury? I just want to be clear about that.
I haven't been to Middlebury. No.
Okay, so you're observing the press like everybody else, but let's talk.
There's some interesting wrinkles to it. So they have the Charles Murray. I guess let me brief background. I know you know this, but just for the audience, and I'm sure you're probably familiar.
Good.
Charles Murray, controversial social scientist, comes to speak at Middlebury. He's there to talk about coming apart, sort of his masterwork diagnosing some of the trends of America separating into two separate classes, this separation being one of the probably essential factors that contributed to the rise of Donald J. Trump. But he also, infamously had been the co-author of The Bell Curve in the 1980s, a book that, insofar as I understand it, I'm not an expert in this, makes claims about differences in average IQ between the races. The students' understanding of what he apparently had argued for, which we've now learned didn't come from actually reading a single word of his work, but from reading like half an entry on the Southern Poverty Law Center's profile of Charles Murray. They decide that he's a white supremacist. They start shouting the second that he gets up to speak. They don't stop shouting. And then the Middlebury, it turns out, has a contingency plan in place, just like you were talking about at Brown, where Charles Murray and then the professor that had volunteered to conduct the conversation with him, specifically a professor who's openly quite liberal as a Democrat and had wanted to conduct the conversation with him specifically to challenge him on some of the assertions that he makes in the Bell Curve. They go to an undisclosed location on campus to live stream the event and to take questions from students who are watching it over the internet. Now, I will tell you this administrator's presumption that having a fallback plan would suddenly deplete the protesters of their zeal, where they could recognize the futility of their doing. It didn't happen in Middlebury. What the students actually did was quite devious. If you can go and you can watch the entire live stream on Middlebury's website. And throughout the course of it, on a regular basis, every 6 or 7 minutes, the speech is being disrupted by a fire alarm. Now, it's not exactly the reason why you think. The students weren't just pulling the fire alarm because they were trying to disrupt the speech. It turns out what they had been doing is they were watching the live stream, pulling fire alarms, and then geolocating the room based upon how loud the alarm was. And this technique works. They're able to find where this undisclosed room was. And then at the back 10 to 15 minutes of Charles Murray's speech, he's barely able to get a word out because there's this low-level, rambunctious, loud, oftentimes a violent crowd outside. Again, I'm going on a little bit. Let me just finish the thing, and then we can bring it back to Brown, which is it's loud. You're hearing the protesting. You're hearing a lot of drums. The protesters always have drums. And then we now know, after the live stream cuts off and they leave the room, even though they have 2 security guards, the professor gets physically assaulted and has to go to the hospital. And the real kicker, so I actually have a piece out this morning specifically about this on the American Conservative, is even though the students engaged in obvious violations of the Student Code of Conduct at Middlebury and criminal law, all the punishments that have come down so far for the Middlebury protesters have been, I think feckless is too nice of an adjective. The Middlebury hasn't, it's been leaked what these these punishments are, and they're basically like a non-official probation letter that's being put into the student's files that evaporates upon graduation. So essentially a non-punishment. And to me, that just reveals a deeper institutional cowardice that is in part a function of this finishing school for the ruling class mentality or culture, which says that we, as the people that run the school, are obligated only to affirm the students, and that we're not allowed to discipline them because they're the customers, and the customers are always right. And it seems like that exact same logic or that mechanics of that culture is at work at my alma mater.
Yeah. Okay, so, and we should talk about the Middlebury incident, although you described it very well. The issue of punishment is important. It came up here at Brown all the way back to the Ray Kelly affair. My understanding is that the practice at most institutions is that these deliberations are secret, so it would have to have been a leak for anybody outside to know how the students were dealt with. I still don't know, and was told this directly by the president of my university, how or whether the students who participated in preventing the New York police commissioner from speaking 3 or 4 years ago at Brown were disciplined. I guess such pushback as I am in a position to offer, with integrity, would have to do with the broad and sweeping characterizations that you're making about these institutions, which are complicated and variegated, systems of interaction, students, faculty, research, so forth, education, graduate education. There's a science and engineering and medical and whatnot enterprise that's ongoing where you might not see a lot of the kind of thing that you're talking about. How much power students have relative to how much power faculty have. We'd have to go into dissecting the faculty. I mean, for example, at Yale, where you do a very good job exposing some of the corrupt and events that have transpired there, and some of the attitudes and behaviors from students that are very troubling. There are faculty who are extremely sympathetic to what those students are doing. It's not as if the faculty are being silenced by the administration. The faculty are, in part, cheerleaders for the enterprise.
So can I ask you, what would you get? I mean, so I have often found myself when I'm speaking to students finding myself in the surprising position of actually coming to the defense of the professoriate, where obviously there is some small slice of these professors that are enthralled with a radical politics that equates words with violence, and if you stand in the way of the Marxist utopian revolution, you're an enemy of the people or whatever. But I guess in my sense, it always felt like a relatively small slice. And to me, like, the fact that one of the most powerful articulations for the value of open dialogue on college campuses of the last year or so was co-signed by Princeton professor Cornel West, who I'm sure you're a massive fan of, but who's this radical Marxist who called Barack Obama an Uncle Tom, like someone who's very, very far on the left, but still was willing to openly come out and sign a statement which said
with Robert George. This is the statement you're referring to? Yeah.
It's like, so if even someone who's that far along can still endorse these essential principles of civil discourse that we're talking about, I feel like the slice of the professorate that is really the problem is actually quite small. But I got to tell you, Glenn, what you just said to me, that was, of all the critiques I've heard of the sequel to the mini doc series, that's the one that I've always found the most powerful, and that does give me hesitation that perhaps I'm missing some of the kind of core mechanics of this.
Yeah, let me say about Cornel West. Yes, he's a man of the left. There's not any doubt about that. I mean, he's devoted his life to what he believes is, the struggle for social justice. I disagree with him about a lot of the particulars, but I actually respect both the quality of his mind and the integrity of his commitment. I think he's he's a straight shooter. So I wasn't at all surprised to hear that he had teamed up with Robert George, who's a conservative political philosopher at Princeton, to issue this statement. And the thing I liked most about the statement was it's the extent to which it reorients the argument about free speech from being a debate over the rights of the speaker to deliver the message to being a observation about the entitlement of the audience to hear from a speaker, right? I mean, when you keep Ray Kelly from speaking, you not only, shut down Ray Kelly, you also prevent, anybody else at Brown who might want to hear from Ray Kelly from being able to hear, including, importantly, people who might seriously disagree with Ray Kelly, but nevertheless want to engage with him.
Right, so let me ask you this. So, but that, unless but this is what and you're right at ground zero now, so you can tell me if this is accurate, which is, let's say at a place like Brown, there is a way in which the fixation on individual high-profile instances of censorship, like the stuff that makes the front page of the Drudge Report, kind of obscures the even deeper problem, which is a low-level culture of self-censorship in which people don't even express the opinion, so of course they don't get shut down, right? Like you don't need to, the Brown Daily Herald doesn't need to pull a column that never gets written. Protesters don't need to shut down a speaker who never gets invited. And that enables a certain intellectual fragility and a homogeneity that can be just as destructive as these high-profile instances of people being shut down. That's the thing that I worry about more, particularly when it comes to a place like Brown, that the students are never even hearing a forceful articulation of an opposing political opinion in the first place. For
example, any open support for Donald Trump. I don't know if there's any member of my faculty who actually supports Donald Trump, but I have a faculty at Brown of, 700 people. The odds that nobody in that faculty voted for are pretty low, I would say.
Someone did. Someone in the econ department definitely did.
but it would be unimaginable that you'd see somebody with a poster on their office door, that you'd see somebody, creating a little group, supervising a group of students who wanted to do, pro-Trump, give Trump a chance kind of activities, that members of the administration who might be controversial would be invited to the university to give speeches. It is a serious problem, and I have been thinking about the self-censorship problem for many years, and in a piece that I wrote in the 90s,
I just read it, the one that you did for AEI, or I think that was maybe the speech that you did. That
was a speech that speech at AEI was drawn from an article that was ultimately published in 1994 in the journal Rationality and Society, and it's called Self-Censorship and Public Discourse, a Theory of Political Correctness. And in it, I say, you censor people, you can shut them down, but the much more insidious problem, it's not the iron fist of repression, it's the velvet glove of seduction. That was one of my artful sentences. That's the problem, because people's reputation, is at stake, and they want to avoid damage to their reputation by being associated with politically unpopular causes or ideas, and hence they will not only censor what they say, but also change what they do, including whom they might invite to speak to their classes or to the students at the university, so as to avoid that kind of reputational damage.
Right.
And I think we see that all over the place, not just in universities.
I guess so. But for me, the thing is these kind of toxic levels. I basically see the university system as our only hope in combating these ever more toxic levels of incivility in public discourse. Like you and I, and you articulated excellently in the mini doc that we did together, like these are the institutions that we've set up to basically force people to actually confront ideas on the other side of the aisle and to build up that neural tissue to learn how to muster logic and evidence to make their cases. And if they're not going to do it, Glenn, who is?
Well, that's right. We're there to train the students or to teach them or to lead them in their own quest on learning how to think and how to argue and how to express themselves and what is evidence and to appreciate the subtlety and complexity of the kind of phenomena that we are confronting and so on, and to be appreciative of the long traditions of inquiry that have gone before us, in which other earlier generations have grappled with the same issues. And my greatest concern, I mean, you take Charles Murray, for example. Let's talk in a concrete term. So here we have the author with Richard Herrnstein, the late Richard Herrnstein, of The Bell Curve. And yes, there is a chapter in The Bell Curve in which they talk about race and IQ, and in which they make claims about racial differences in IQ. Claims, by the way, for which there is a fair amount of evidence, at least in terms of the issue of cognitive abilities as expressed in people's test taking. There's a more controversial question about whether or not racial differences in intellectual performance are rooted in genetic inheritance. And I think that's a tougher case. But anyway, my main point is there's a vast amount to know about the measurement of human intelligence, its change over time, the extent to which the evidence supports claims about the heritability of intelligence, the differences of amongst various population aggregates in intelligence, the implications of individual differences in intelligence for individual differences in other kinds of social performance. There's a great deal to know about it. It's not a simple matter at all. And right. The stick-figured kind of, cartoonish treatment of these questions by people, including the Southern Poverty Law Center, for that matter. I mean, white supremacist, you're a white supremacist or a white nationalist if you ask a question. This is a kind of know-nothingism. This is a kind of anti-intellectualism, really, and it has no place in the university, I should think. You can meet and answer Charles Murray if you disagree with him, as many do. Many serious social psychologists and cognitive psychologists do. Meet him on the ground where these arguments should be decided, which is who's done what study and what has that study shown. And these kids, and their faculty, for that matter, who were sympathetic to these protests, think that it's so beneath contempt, the views that are associated with this man, that they need not acquaint themselves with any of the arguments or the evidence. They can simply slap a label on it and be dismissive or worse of the positions with which they disagree. So that's right. Deeply troubling to me.
Right. And again, at an institution of higher learning at Middlebury, the idea that this stuff is on full display is disheartening. Like, if Charles Murray is a white supremacist, he's a self-loathing one. He has 2 biracial children, and his work has also shown that, on average, the IQ of a white person is lower than the IQ of an East Asian person.
Yeah, and his wife is Asian, by the way.
First wife.
Was. Oh, I'm sorry. I haven't kept up with Mary.
But again, also that it's not very difficult to find these facts out, right? But the idea that you could have a mass of protesters that hadn't even read a single word of his work and openly admitted it to national news outlets, I mean, that is a very virulent strain of know-nothingness. And the idea that the official university response is going to be, well, we're going to live stream it in a separate location, that does sound like a capitulation. What they should be hearing is what you just said to me, right? Like, why else are the faculty there? Why else are the professors there other than to directly confront a bunch of 19 and 21-year-olds who I know, because I used to be one of them, are very prone to these bouts of self-righteous intolerance, have someone like you who is smarter than they are, who knows more than they are, directly confronting them and making them recognize the vast well of ignorance upon which they currently stand. That visual metaphor didn't quite work, but I think you know what I'm trying to get at. That's what, out of all places, they should be running into the brick wall of the professor pool who is saying, you think that there is a neat narrative about this, a neat narrative that just so happens to situate you as the great hero in a struggle for social justice. You are wrong. The world is much more complex than you could ever begin to fathom. And that almost never happens. I mean, is that inaccurate or is that overly critical?
No, I'm sorry to say that it's largely accurate. I do, I'm going to continue my pushback momentarily, but I need to agree with you about something.
I don't want it. I want the agreement. I want the affirmation.
So Angela Davis comes to Brown to give a lecture, and I managed to get shoehorned into the auditorium at the last minute because I'm Professor Lowry and I could call the provost's office and get in. But there wasn't an empty seat in the vast auditorium. She was practically carried into the stage on a throne chair. Now, that's not literally what happened, but I'm telling you, the standing ovation and the kind of worship, it was worshipful. She got up there and she gave a speech. It was not incoherent, but it was not persuasive to me. Okay, I could go into it, but I don't want to. Our time is limited here. Everything she said was cheered to the rafters by 500 students filling up an auditorium. It was worshipful. There was a question and answer period in which I heard not a single challenging question. Angela Davis had said some things about feminism. She had said some things about race. She had said some things about American politics. She had declared that it was an imperative that prisons be abolished without ever saying what would be done in order to maintain public safety and social order, given that there are people who are engaged in criminal activities in our midst. Nobody asked how that was going to work. Nobody asked whether or not African American and Latino low-income people living in disorderly communities would be the ones to suffer the most. No one asked for any evidence. No one asked for any argument from her other than the slogans that she was bandying about. And then at the end, again, she was practically carried out of the auditorium on a throne chair with the fawning acolytes. So Angela Davis, a lesbian, African-American, communist, social justice fighter. Such people exist, and there's no, it's a world that's big enough to accommodate a lot of people, can come to Brown and be feted and celebrated as a hero. And, the guy who runs the police department in New York City can't be permitted to speak. when most of the people in the auditorium, if he had been permitted to speak, would have been able to push back and argue with him. I mean, now.
And again, so the idea is, you finish your thought first, but there was.
No, I'm done. I'm done.
The idea is that warm womb of affirmation that I think a lot of these students find themselves in. Again, I mean, and John McWhorter has been very good about this, where it's not by happenstance that going to an Angela Davis lecture would feel like church, because there is a spiritual and a religious component to it, where they're all kind of worshiping at this. They're worshiping an idol who represents kind of a pseudo-religious set of politics. But if that's what you spend your formative years in, it's not going to be any surprise that when you become an adult who lives in one of these corridors of elite power, you're not going to be prone to demonstrate the liberal arts values of civility and an embrace of intellectual complexity. So, for instance, if, let's say, the new token conservative columnist at the New York Times, for his opening column, pens a mildly critical op-ed about the prevailing climate change narrative.
Yeah, this is Bret Stephens, by the way.
Bret Stephens is going to be met with a mass of subscription cancellations, which I think of to myself as just the Park Slope parent version of deplatforming. It's just the adult version of the habits that were inculcated within them during their formative years, where when you're met with a critical opinion, you don't jump at the chance to engage with it in order to build up that neural tissue. Your first inclination is just to shut it down in whatever way you can. And so the failure in the formative years for these students does have corrosive effects on the way that we conduct our politics when they become adults. Yeah.
So I'm very friendly with our provost, Ed Brown. I know our president reasonably well. She's an economist. He's a political scientist. This is Richard Locke, the provost at Brown, and Christina Paxson is the president at Brown. And it's a pretty small world, here. People see each other often, and we talk. Here's what I can imagine they might say.
Okay.
Maybe not directly, but this would be the underlying idea. You think this job is easy? You think that it's just a matter of locking up some bad actors, of punishing some people, of making a certain set of speeches and whatnot? This is a fragile and difficult to manage circumstance that we have here. Sure, we can drag screaming kids out of an auditorium by force. We can do that. But have you got any idea how much damage to the institution would be done by having incidents like that broadcast in perpetuity and by provoking even greater unrest and alienation in our student body? You say we're coddling. You say we're coddling and whatnot. Well, those are easy things for you to say because you don't have the responsibility of actually running these institutions. Okay, some kids sat in my office and I didn't have them dragged out. Instead, I came out and tried to talk with them politely. So they were rude to me. And I didn't scream in their faces or turn my back on them, but I endured it. Maybe that wasn't in the fullness of reflection the best way of handling the situation, but it was a difficult situation. And meeting it with brute force, meeting with a kind of attitude of contempt for these kids and trying to rely upon the effects of threats and punishment isn't necessarily the most effective way to deal with this. At the end of the day, we're trying to calm the waters and trying to maintain an environment in which the important work of the university can get done, and it is getting done. These kids are 19, 20, and 21 years old. They are full of fire. They're agitated by issues that are not unimportant, and their views are worthy of consideration. And the fact that I'm not prepared to, make a pitched battle out of every incident on behalf of some abstract principles of free speech. The fact that I'm malleable, that I'm flexible, that I roll with the punches to a certain degree, and that I look to try to tamp down and compromise is part of my job. That's what I'm here to do. Not to be a mouthpiece for some kind of right-wing, rigid, inflexible, ideological opposition to students.
I'd say it's a bit of a mischaracterization, but Glenn, I think you did a pretty good job.
I tried.
Of what they were trying to say.
I really tried, man.
I guess what I would say is, and again, just to break off specifically the quality of educational services provided to the undergraduates, because I do think you make a good point that this is an extremely complex organism that has many other components to it other than just educating 18 to 22-year-olds. Let's just talk about the quality of the undergraduate experience.
Okay.
How has your flexible, pragmatic approach been doing the last 10 years, Mr. Administrator? Have you noticed? Do you get the sense that it has worked to calm the waters? Is that what you would describe what's happening on campuses like Brown? Is it even achieving your intended purpose of making students feel at home and more comfortable at Brown? Is that what you think that they would say? I feel like this particular approach has been tried for a while now, and we're getting to witness what the fruits of it are. And they are not what your kind of stand-in administrative representative would say they are. There's a way that ideological flexibility is premised on the idea that this kind of virulent activism can ever be satisfied, right? That if you just cut enough checks, if you hire enough inclusivity deans, if you start enough cultural houses, if you create enough, special orientation days for incoming freshmen, that at a certain point you will have achieved some, you will have satisfied their grievances. And I think that is fundamentally a faulty assumption. That's how I would respond to what Glenn Loury just said.
Yeah, the waters have been relatively calm at Brown in this last year since I came back from Stanford. We haven't had any incidents like the ones that you focused on in your documentary film about Brown. So I think they'd probably say, the people I was referring to, my provost and president, that we're getting by. They have instituted a massive set of initiatives under the rubric of diversity and inclusion, which are meant to be responsive to student demands and concerns. There has been an expansion of the administrative footprint in the university as deans and associate deans have been hired and positions have been created. There are some debates that don't happen. Affirmative action. So again, I'm on the faculty executive council. So the administrator responsible, or the chairman of the committee on academic conduct. So this is like plagiarism or problems like that comes in. So he's presenting statistics. And I asked whether or not there was an ethnic or racial breakdown in those statistics. Not that I have any suspicions one way or the other. I just wanted to know. And you should have seen the look of horror on his face. The very idea that you would break those numbers out by race was, likewise for people who don't graduate on time and, are suspended or put into some kind of probationary status because of poor performance. The kicker for me was, it used to be when a crime occurred, like a robbery on the College Hill, that there would be a university-wide dissemination by the public safety department of the details about the crime, including a description of the perpetrator if one were available. Male, female, 5'6", 6'2", black, Latino, brown jacket, green shirt. When I came back from Stanford in September and I got a couple of these notices, it struck me that no longer were they describing by race or ethnicity, to the extent that that could be discerned from visual information, the people who were alleged to have committed these crimes, because they happen periodically. Somebody gets their mobile phone taken or snatched, or they get held up at knife point or whatever. And I thought, how did that decision get made? The decision about whether or not the racial information was pertinent. Now, if the point of disseminating this is to make us alert to the possibility of danger, you might think that that information would be useful. On the other hand, and it's a subtle problem, because on the other hand, of course, disproportionately, those assailants are going to be non-white in Providence, Rhode Island. Maybe in some other town it would be different. But in Providence, Rhode Island, disproportionately, those assailants are going to be non-white. I think I can say that with a fair degree of confidence. Now, when I get the report and there is no description of the race, I have to make a presumption about who it was. And my maximum likelihood estimate, as the statisticians say, is that it's a black male in his early 20s or late teens who has come up the hill from the flat part of town and is trying to make a buck. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on. I don't know that I'm actually making any particular point. I'm just
so when you're talking about the relative calm since you came back to so I'll tell you who I think about a lot, and then I want to ask you a specific question, which is
all right.
One of the students that was in the Brown mini doc that you and I were in. So Chris Robotham, who started this Reason at Brown secret Facebook group that was intended to sort of basically facilitate the open conversation about controversial topics that he, who at the time was a sophomore at Brown, felt was completely missing from his undergraduate education.
I didn't know Chris was the founder of that group, which I belong to, actually. Not a secret.
It is, but, and I think Chris wouldn't mind me saying this, like that so this is someone who's an extremely smart guy, is very smart in the video, really cares about ideas, is basically like is a Democrat, is like a kind of standard issue Democrat, who I think is like, he's kind of doing the reverse Glenn Lowry right now. He's going from moderate Democrat to maybe moderate conservative, but he's not an extremist in any sense. He doesn't like.
Thanks
Trump.
a lot, Rob. That really helps. Anyway, go ahead. You talk about Chris.
But he's but the fate, like I from what I understand it, this is someone who really cares about ideas. The Facebook group, I think, has been since shut down. Chris, I think, took at least a semester or two off from Brown. I think he's coming back this upcoming semester. But again, I don't want to presume to speak for him or his experience, but at least from my outsider observation, it does feel like he doesn't feel as if there's any place for him at Brown University for someone who really is there to, the primary thing he wants to do is engage with ideas and to sort of sharpen his mind.
Well, that's a shame that he should think so.
Yeah, I don't know if again I don't want to.
Yeah, speak for
project
him.
on him, but I think it is, right? So The specific question I have is, so there's the last year or so you're saying has been relatively calm at Brown. Have there been instances of there being speakers who kind of break from the standard progressive orthodoxy that have come in, that have had large audiences and that have received have been received civilly?
Well, yeah, I don't know if all of these people... Jeffrey Stone, law professor, University of Chicago. I hope I'm getting this right. I might be getting this guy's name. The provost, here, let me put it this way. The provost has sponsored a series of lectures where people have come in and given big talks, and they've been across the political spectrum, not the far right, but there've been some who've been more conservative. So, and in one of those instances, I had the following. One of those occasions had the following instance. I believe it is Jeffrey Stone. We should look this up. I hope I'm getting the name right.
Okay.
Who is a free speech constitutional lawyer and has been dean of the University of Chicago Law School. Again, if I get his name wrong, I apologize. And writes a lot about these kinds of issues. And he comes to Brown to talk. And in the course of the lecture that he's giving, in context, he uses the N-word.
Huh.
He's trying to illustrate an instance in which in class something is said. So he's quoting something that had been said in class, where in the context of the class, the use of the N-word was like somebody said the N-word, and then the reaction was the following. And so he's relating that instance. So he uses the N-word in the lecture. So at the end, a student chastises him for using the N-word, says that she was offended by the use of that word.
Okay.
And he pushes back very vigorously. He says, look, I don't apologize to you about using a word, in effect, in inverted commas, as I was trying to relate something where it was very natural and appropriate to use the word. In other words, he was telling her, I could care less about the fact that you were offended by it. That's not relevant to me. You don't get to tell me what words to use.
Huh.
Okay? I didn't curse you. I didn't say anything negative or disrespectful to you. I was speaking, and the word was appropriate in the context. You don't get to decide this. Okay? Now, that happened. The roof didn't fall in. Everybody didn't rise from their chairs and walk out. I actually thought it was a very important, as it were, teachable moment.
Yeah.
Of what was going on there. He stood his ground. And he used the word again. and then said something like, if it's okay for me to actually, I mean, he had a little bit of an attitude about it.
Okay.
And I was actually, now there were some people who didn't like it. I heard later from some of my colleagues at the Faculty Executive Council that was not a high moment and that he should have been more solicitous of the student and whatnot. Right. But as a matter of fact, he wasn't. And at the dinner at the president's house that evening, and I was there, someone whom I don't want to name tried to chastise him a little bit about it, and he was still pushing back. And we had a discussion around the table in which there were different points of view about that. But what was being opposed was, on the one hand, his sense that, I'm not going to capitulate to you because of, your feeling. And this person sensed that it's not a safe space for me if you're going to come in here and use the N-word. And at Brown University on this particular occasion, the speaker prevailed.
Right. And again, without saying, I'm like, without trying to judge the merits of his logic for using that particular word, how often, though, does anything that remotely resembles that kind of interaction happen in your experience? I mean, what you're talking about is, I think, basically what I'd like to happen more often, which is professors, regardless of their politics, being willing to push back against student kind of presumptuousness or self-righteousness. And again, I mean this.
It happens, Rob, more often than you might think. Okay. I mean, that's why I'm trying to say it's a complicated. It's not a stick figure, black and white. The world is gray.
I know
that scene from one of those movies. Anyway. It's one of the Tom Clancy novels. I think it's Clear and Present Danger or something like that. But in any case, that's neither here nor there. I teach a course called Race and Inequality in America. I teach it every fall to about 80 or 90 students. In that course, I say things about affirmative action that are not liked by the students. I say the attack on Justice Scalia for asking the question of whether or not affirmative action can harm black students by leading them to study at institutions where they're not as adequately prepared as they should be was not a racist question. It was a fair question. And by the way, there's some evidence that this mismatch hypothesis might have something to it. Let's look at the evidence. And I say, we've got jails full of black people. You think it's all about racism? No. What about the behavior of people, the law-breaking behavior, the violent behavior that makes lives miserable for the residents of the communities where that behavior is taking place? What about that? In fact, if you walk the streets of a inner city and you ask people what do they want to happen, half the time they're going to tell you they want more cops and they want those cops to get the violent, quote, thugs, close quote, off of the street. That's what you're going to hear those people saying. Do their voices count? Do their lives matter? I say that kind of thing to these students. I say, we read a book called The Asian Achievement Paradox. The book by Min Zhou and Jennifer Lee, two Asian American, as it happens, sociologists, chronicles the extraordinary achievement in elite higher education of Asian Americans, who are a third, 40% in some instances of the student bodies at many of these elite colleges, and who are testing off the charts. And we go into the details, and I assign a paper to the students saying, okay, do you think culture has anything to do with the idea that there are such disparities between Asians and whites and non-whites in terms of academic achievement? If you do, tell me why. If you don't, tell me why. And please be specific in citing evidence to this effect from the book and from any other literature that you might acquaint yourself with. The roof did not cave in on that class. Okay, I had a guy come in and give a guest lecture. This is Thomas Chatterton Williams. He's a writer, an African-American who lives in Europe, who's written a very fine book called Losing My Cool, in which he describes being a black, hip millennial teenager in New Jersey, but then kind of outgrowing the parochialism of the hip-hop culture and whatnot, discovering books, getting to Georgetown University, getting a real education, becoming an intellectual, learning to speak the French language, traveling to Europe, and marrying a French woman, and he's a half white, half black, one parent white, one parent black man himself. So now his daughter is 3/4 white, quote unquote.
I know. I follow him on Instagram. Yeah.
Oh, you follow? So you know who comes, but the audience might not know. The audience might not know. Anyway, he comes to the class and he's talking about identity, and he's saying we ought to be more fluid about this. And he's saying this black-white stuff is a little bit more complicated. And he's saying, my mother is white. And my child's grandmother is white, and two of her grandmothers are white, and one of the grandfathers is white. Is my child going to be black forever? Are we going to have, and we're talking about these things, and there's pushback, and there's back and forth, and so on and so forth. So that is happening, and I'll stop, but I'll just tell you this. I had 85 students. At the end of the class, I had 5 blacks. 5 out of 85 students in a course on race and inequality in America. And so I asked one who I'd become friendly with, where are the black students? And his answer was, Professor Lowery, don't you know the word is out about you?
Oh.
and that I was being, in a way, blackballed or blacklisted or whatever, people just not signing up for my course because the word was how Lowry is concerned. So I was permitted to have an interesting course, and of course I argued on both sides of many of these issues in the course as a way of trying to be a good instructor and make the students aware of all the arguments at play. But it was a self-selected audience, and the students whom I might have most wanted to reach with some of these concerns elected not to be present. So there was that. But certainly nobody stood up in the back of my class and started shouting at me.
Yeah, so, yeah, it's still dispiriting. Your story is still dispiriting. The kind of a rejoinder that I've done for this before, just to make sure that it's not a complete, it's overly lopsided in the critique. Like, I've been speaking at a lot of colleges now, and I've noticed that the intellectual atrophy that occurs is not confined to the left. There will be a lot of like proud college Republicans at some large state school. Maybe they'll even be wearing a "Make America Great Again" hat when they come to one of my screenings. And typically, though, and they're very, a lot of them, it's like they're just doing the right-leaning version of virtue signaling with that hat. Like they're they take pride in the fact that they're part of a marginalized group on their campus.
Okay.
But then you start talking to them afterwards and start challenging them ever so lightly about some of the presumptions that they're making about the nature of the American project, and it's without fail. It's shocking how quickly their cases devolve into anti-intellectual nonsense, that it's obvious that these guys have actually not been seriously challenged either. That like on multiple occasions, members in good standing of Ronald Reagan's party have like defended Putin's annexation of Crimea to me. And I'm like, where did you even get, like, are you even thinking about what you're talking about? Like, because you've just been told that now that Trump is your God and savior, that we're supposed to be friendly with the Kremlin. But there's this idea where they can get away with that stuff and they can spend 4 years at an institution of higher learning without ever being seriously challenged, because on the other side, they're only met with these kind of garbage protest hysterics. That no one is challenging them either.
That's a good point, bro.
Yeah.
No, the kind of polarization, the segregation of communities of discourse, the fact that we become echo chambers and reiterate to one another the things that we already believe is corrupting and, debasing of intellectual integrity across the board, not just on the left.
Right.
Why don't we call it a conversation for now, Rob? We've run to 60 minutes or so, and, we can always have another one.
We can, Glenn. It was excellent to talk to you as always.
Okay, I tried to push back as best I could, Rob, but my heart wasn't in it.
I feel like you still did a good job. Even a half-hearted Glenn Loury one it's very powerful, and I found myself not knowing quite what I was going to say, but that was great. Hey, so
all right, Rob.
Can I ask you a quick? Now, how many? You have 4 children, 5 children.
I have 5 children, 6 grandchildren.
How many of them at one time ever lived? Like, how many of them were in the same house at the same time?
Okay,
so I don't know if it's complicated. I have a daughter, and I'm about to have a second one in September. And I just noticed that I see your kids a lot on social media, and I kind of like want to know what Glenn Loury's experience was with this ever expanding brood. But this might be too long of a conversation.
I think it is indeed. My youngest is 25. My oldest is 50. There are 2 marriages involved.
I know that, yeah.
And so forth. So it's a long story. How often? I'm happy to talk about it at some point. But yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, it was. I just wanted to get it clarified. We'll talk about it at some point.
Okay.
Thanks for doing this, Glenn. I appreciate it.
Thanks for doing this, Rob. I appreciate it.